Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, I was discussing spiritual pursuits with followers of a more distant tradition recently. They had some deeply troubling misconceptions about the Dharma, that it was a dour, depressing thing that negates the world and denies free will. Having studied it and experienced it, I knew this to be incorrect, but had difficulty articulating why. After all, samsara is ever marked by dukkha, ignorance, and desire. These are immutable facts. All sentient beings will face these experiences. They will age, they will become ill, and they will die. Rather dour and depressing thought. How would you correct these misconceptions?
This is an interesting question. The Buddha definitely does validate free will. When we do good, it begets good for us and for the world around us. When we do bad, it begets bad. This good advances us and those around us toward enlightenment. You're right that these characteristics of samsara are immutable and unchangeable, but that doesn't really matter. We can free ourselves from those experiences nonetheless through practice and study.
Interesting. So it's not a matter of changing samsara, it's a matter of changing ourselves and those around us.
Indeed. Many of the Buddha's followers argue that dukkha, ignorance, and desire live in our consciousnesses, and are thus cognized into the world around us through the karmic act of ongoing experience. Thus, if we purify the mind, we purify our experience. And if we purify our experience, we haven't changed samsara, but we have detached ourselves from dukkha, ignorance, and desire.
In that case, would it be right to say that dukkha, delusion, and desire are but descriptors of things imposed by the language and the human mind, rather than actual things that exist in the world? One cannot change the unfolding of reality that causes dukkha, ignorance, and desire, but one can change themselves so that the unfolding of reality does not cause those things in one.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing a common misconception of Buddhism in the West. Do Buddhists reject the world? Do Buddhists believe that life is nothing but suffering? Are Buddhists fatalists or nihilists? We hope you enjoy. So, to get started, do Buddhists reject the world?
This is an interesting and complicated question, and it's also very open to interpretation. What does it actually mean to reject the world? For this discussion, we will say that rejecting the world means downplaying the positive, salvific, or otherwise wholesome qualities of everyday life and experience, instead emphasizing the perfection and purity of something beyond, like nirvana, an afterlife, or oblivion. The opposite idea would be affirming that the world we experience on an everyday basis is inherently, or at least mostly, good, positive, wholesome, or holy in some way. This would downplay the positive qualities of an afterlife. These categories are highly subjective and interpretive. One could say Christianity is world-negating because it argues that this life is not the final destination and that the afterlife is eternal. So what you do in this life only matters insofar as it decides which afterlife you go to after you die. On the other hand, it could also be world-affirming because it regards the world as being made by a benevolent God who pervades the world around us and us ourselves. It just depends on your point of view. These categories were created and discussed among colonialist and imperialist scholars in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries who were seeking to sort, categorize, compare, and contrast world religions according to their doctrines. In modern scholarship, these categories have been left behind, and rightfully so, because they are so interpretive and they're so easily bent to agendas and they're biased to the point that they're meaningless and useless. However, they still determine how we think about religion in the world today, in some very subtle ways. This worldly concerns and otherworldly concerns have been topics of debate and discussion in the world of religion for as long as religion has existed. And so the common perception of how much this worldly benefit and how much otherworldly benefit a given religion has or doesn't have is very important to understand. In Buddhism, especially in early Buddhism, the everyday world that we experience is regarded as being samsara. Samsara is the realm of reincarnation, dukkha, and ignorance. Our everyday experience is marked by these characteristics. In these earlier texts, the characteristics are not subject to interpretation or to choice or to faith. They are truths, in the most capital T truth sense. This can be interpreted to be an inherently negative and pessimistic view of the world. It can also be interpreted as a predestined or a deterministic view of the world, since dukkha is regarded as being inevitable and unchangeable. It's very common for world-negating ways of thinking to downplay the existence or the efficacy of human free will as well. People who believe that the world is predestined will say that free will doesn't exist. People who believe that free will exists but that the world is still inherently inadequate or insufficient for true joy and happiness say that free will doesn't make a difference. However, the Buddha argues quite the opposite of all of these points, showing that this state of affairs can be overcome through practice and study. He argues that the end point is enlightenment, which is a totally changed view of the world we live in, and this changed view has the characteristics of being free from desire, free from dukkha, free from ignorance, and free from the cycle of reincarnation. Getting to this state is heavily encouraged. Early Buddhism encourages practitioners to leave their everyday lives to try to remove the roots of dukkha and desire and ignorance, but those practitioners still exist in this world. The state of enlightenment is achieved here, in the world we live in, not beyond death. It's a part of everyday life. Similarly, Mahayana Buddhism proclaims that the everyday world is Buddha nature and is possessed of inherently enlightening characteristics, even when it presents itself as dukkha or something unwholesome. It's part of the Buddha's dharma, so even dukkha itself is affirmed as being inherently enlightening in some way. Similarly, enlightenment and Buddhahood is regarded as being achievable in this very life through the pursuit of the bodhisattva path. In a truly world-negating system, the bodhisattva path, the pursuit of the salvation of all sentient beings in the world, would be completely pointless. Doing moral good as a means of saving yourself or others in this life has no meaning or significance in world-negating ways of thinking. But it is absolutely meaningful and significant in Buddhism, showing you that Buddhism is not world-negating at all. It may appear that way when it claims the universality of dukkha, and when it encourages you to renounce and pursue the Dharma, especially without context, but this is clearly not the whole story.
Do Buddhists believe that life is nothing but suffering?
Short answer, no. For the purposes of this question, we used the word suffering and not dukkha. Because of that, we're talking about English language suffering, or the experience of extreme negative feelings, like pain, sadness, grief, anger, etc. As we've discussed extensively in this show, this is not what dukkha means. Buddhism believes all life is dukkha, which refers to unsatisfactoriness. We desire 100% good and 0% bad, but reality will never provide that for us. Also, good things are marked by dukkha because they are finite and impermanent. Bad is marked by dukkha because it will come to you sometime, no matter what. In Buddhism, life can be nothing but suffering, as is the case of hell dwellers, but it isn't always suffering, as in the case, for example, of devas who live extraordinarily long and pleasant lives. At the end of the day, dukkha refers to something entirely different from suffering. In the case of Mahayana Buddhism, I don't think that the doctrine or the texts care one way or the other if life truly is suffering or not. The core meaning of life is the bodhisattva path, reducing the suffering and the dukkha of sentient beings everywhere. So no matter what, the bodhisattva path has a purpose and a meaning. This is true whether life is super euphoric most of the time, in which case bodhisattvas would try to break people's attachment and desire for continued euphoria, or if life is mostly bad all the time, in which case bodhisattvas would try to remove people's desire for good and aversion to bad. Thus, Mahayana Buddhism seeks to transcend questions that pervade nihilism, fatalism, and existentialism. Does moral good matter? Does it actually make the world a better place? Does it take us to heaven when we die? Buddhism says yes, but remember that good and bad are dualistic, and they are subject to interpretation, opinion, context, and other self-reifying notions. Because of this, because they are a dualism, they must be transcended. What matters is the Dharma and the path of enlightenment. If you need to justify doing good by claiming that it leads to benefits for you personally, then at least you're doing good, but you've also missed the entire point. It is far better to do good out of true selflessness, with no need for justification, no expectation of benefits in return, or no reasoning or logic. Those are all based in self-centered and self-reifying ways of thinking. I do good because it is good for me. I do good because good exists and is different from bad. I do good because it leads to XYZ in the future. All of these are misunderstandings of the Bodhisattva path and of morality in Buddhism. The next question then becomes, why does anybody think of Buddhism this way? It is because, as we've discussed on the show before and will discuss again, Europeans with colonialist and Judeo-Christian biases and agendas mistranslated and misunderstood the term dukkha, or the term impermanence, or the term emptiness. European thinkers who were so steeped in contemporary philosophies such as nihilism and fatalism looked to Buddhism to reinforce their arguments. Similarly, colonizers attempted to critique and belittle Buddhism and Asian culture in general for the purposes of justifying colonialism and theft of resources.
Are Buddhists fatalists or nihilists?
This is probably the most common misconception about Buddhism in the West. One reason that it pervades is that Western and European thinkers with Judeo-Christian backgrounds misunderstood and mistranslated Buddhist texts, and then propagated their unsubstantiated interpretations of them. This was/has been promoted both deliberately and unknowingly. Before we dig into these misinterpretations, though, we should define nihilism and fatalism. Nihilism is a European philosophy first introduced by German philosopher Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, and then expounded on by famous philosophers such as Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Martin Heidegger. The core point of it is the idea that humans create and impose meaning and significance on an inherently meaningless and insignificant life and world. Experiencing good now does not prevent experiences of bad in the future, nor does it directly lead to any lasting or substantial good in the future. Doing bad now similarly does not bear on whether or not random good will appear later. Thus, there is a tension between how we want the world to be and how it actually is. We want all good and no bad, but we can't get that in this world. You can see how many thought at the time that this was very similar to Buddhism. Fatalism is the idea that the way life unfolds is predestined, and thus not tied to morality or justice or balance. As a result, nothing we do matters, because whatever good or bad is going to happen to us is already decided. Suffering, not dukkha, suffering, is an inherent, constant, and immutable reality, and so attempts to overcome it through spiritual practice, study, moral behavior, or anything else is completely futile. Because they claim that life is suffering, you can see how they jumped to the concept of dukkha and pointed their fingers and said, see, the Buddhists get it. So let's talk about interpretations of Buddhism as being nihilist or fatalist. Those who have actively and deliberately argued this typically have had an agenda that is colonial, imperial, and racist in nature. 18th and 19th century Europeans who encountered Asian people argued that their societies and their cultures were inherently weak and inferior and thus ripe for colonization, or otherwise in need of salvation and civilization. They wanted their resources and their money, and so they came up with ways to justify taking it. One of these social or cultural weaknesses, they claimed, was that their religions in Asia were world-negating. I'm primarily talking about how British and French people encountering South and Southeast Asian peoples interpreted these things. This could have happened in the British conquest of India or the French conquest of Vietnam. Thus, you should know that the Buddhism that they were encountering was Theravada Buddhism primarily. The colonial powers created these two interpretive categories of world religions. One was world-affirming, and this included Western religions,
Shocking.
such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which they argued created spiritual enrichment and comfort for their practitioners by affirming the world was made and pervaded by God. The other category was world-negating religions. These were Asian ones, which they claimed saw the world as being an overall negative and bad place that needed to be escaped. Thus, quote-unquote, renunciatory religions, like Hinduism and Buddhism, wherein practitioners often left the household in their old age to become monastics or ascetics, were understood to be world-negating, because they encouraged that act of leaving the regular world and seeking enlightenment elsewhere. These colonial powers claimed that because Buddhism proposes that the world we live in is samsara and thus subject to rebirth, ignorance, and dukkha, that it was inherently world-negating. They thought that was the reasoning behind encouraging people to leave and become monks and nuns, that renouncing was done in order to escape and enter into nirvana. They saw emptiness, and they thought that that meant Buddhists think the world is totally bereft of any holy, divine, salvific nature, which would make it a pretty horrible place. They thought that nirvana was like the Christian heaven, and that the Buddhist world of samsara was like a hell of sorts, which needed to be overcome and escaped. In the same breath, they claimed that Christianity was not like this. Instead, it was world-affirming. The people who were making these arguments and these claims were primarily Protestants, so they claimed that Christians believe that God is everywhere and in all of us, and that every single person has a direct connection to God, because we're made in His image, and so we can commune with Him anytime we want. They claimed that South and Southeast Asian Buddhism did not believe we shared any nature with the Buddha. Also, they didn't believe in an omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, all-compassionate creator God. And they did not believe that the world was pervaded by this Holy Spirit.
This reflects a very shallow understanding of the doctrines as well. On the show already, we have discussed ideas that directly contradict all of these claims.
Exactly. The colonial powers saw that Buddhism did not care one way or the other who or what created the world, and they interpreted this to mean that they rejected the world, or they thought that this world didn't matter as much as nirvana matters. As a result, the colonizers claimed the superiority of Christianity and thus justified colonization and missionary efforts and all other sorts of atrocities. Those who passively or unknowingly implied that Buddhism was world-negating most often did so because they too misunderstood the doctrine of something like emptiness. At the time of the colonial encounter, nihilism, existentialism, and other significant secular European philosophies were the talk of the scholarly town. I'm not saying that all Europeans at the time were nihilists or fatalists or existentialists, but I am saying that those philosophies were fresh on the minds of the very first European Buddhologists. Then they encountered impermanence and emptiness, the idea that nothing lasts forever and that there is nothing in reality that has any permanent existence, and they thought that that supported and reinforced nihilism and fatalism. They claimed that because everything was impermanent and empty, then of course there was no reason to believe that anything we do in the moment matters one way or the other. The good thing is that nothing bad lasts forever, but the bad thing is that nothing good lasts forever either. Because neither thing lasts forever, nihilists find a great deal of comfort in not caring one way or the other. They believed that this is what Buddhist equanimity, as is implied in the system of the four jhanas, was all about. They thought that nihilism was the end point of eliminating attachment to the good or to the bad. In both cases, several important factors were ignored. One obvious example is that the Buddha directly rejects nihilism and fatalism in one of the texts. In a text that we will read and discuss soon, called the Apannaka Sutta, the Buddha argues that nihilists, failing to see the good fruits of good verbal, mental, and physical behaviors, will then trend toward their basic animal instincts for seeking sensory pleasure and avoiding sensory pain, and thus will not advance on the path of enlightenment. Furthermore, you'll remember the Samanapala Sutta. In that sutta, King Ajatasattu, seeking to find religious philosophy that suited him, spoke to 6 different thinkers. They were an amoralist, a fatalist, a materialist, an eternalist, a Jain, and an agnostic. Then he goes to the Buddha, and he asks the Buddha to explain why Buddhism is better than those 6. The Buddha explains 10 fruits of the Buddhist way of thinking that beat out the 6 thinkers. For this conversation, the important one to bring up is the fatalist, who argues that since suffering is predestined, the best course is to give up trying to achieve spiritual peace because you won't get it. Buddhism obviously does not think this way. Samsara may indeed be a realm marked by dukkha, delusion, illness, old age, death, etc., but that doesn't mean that you're completely screwed. In fact, the Buddha claims quite the opposite. Because of karma, because of morality, we can reduce and even eliminate dukkha, and thus overcome samsara and achieve enlightenment. This is totally contradictory to fatalism and to nihilism, which shows that to claim Buddhism is either one is a total misunderstanding. Thus, Buddhism is not nihilist or fatalist.
This concludes our discussion of nihilism, fatalism, and Buddhism. We hope you enjoyed. Next week, please join us where we will be discussing the topic of suicide in Buddhism. How ought we understand suicide in Buddhism? When is it acceptable and unacceptable, and why? How has this interacted with and been influenced by different cultures? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening. Hi, Nick here. I just wanted to give a big thanks to Tanner, our first patron on Patreon. Just a reminder, if you would like to join him, you can find us at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism, all one word. Thank you very much for backing us, and we hope you enjoy the show. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.